So I welcome you back to this new semester. As is my custom, I'd like to inform you that this is a bit of a technical unit. Well, like most of the units that you cover in this college. So I encourage you to make sure that you go through the material. You make it a habit to go through the material as frequently as possible um, to avoid having to rush through this material when you hear an assessment has been announced, because that definitely will not work. But this is certainly not the most difficult unit, but you need to concentrate. Um, so I'm going to go straight into the material, which is the initial slide. So basically, security. If I'm going to start off with the definition, security is basically the minimization of threats and vulnerabilities in computers. You look at this from the point of view of a computer system. Threat is basically an event, an undesirable event uh, that you wouldn't want to happen. Yeah. So basically, a threat is any undesirable event that may impact on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information resources, of your system resources. And this event can be, its severity can be interpreted in terms of its probability and impact. There are events which have high probability but low impact, and the events which have low probability but high impact. Knowing that, in the future, when you talk about security uh, uh, policies, it would actually guide you to create proper security policies. The other thing that we want to minimize as per the definition is the vulnerabilities in the system. The vulnerabilities, these are weaknesses that can be exploited by an attacker to bring about the threat, uh, the undesirable events that we want to minimize. So in practice, we say that we minimize, and the reason we say that we minimize is because you cannot actually eliminate threats and vulnerabilities, because one of the biggest vulnerabilities is the actual people that are using the system, and also the biggest source of attacks, so-called insider attacks. So the only way you can actually fully eliminate threats and vulnerabilities is simply not to use the system. But obviously, if you buy the system, then you definitely want to use it. Um, so in general, we have two security objectives. We want to prevent the occurrence of attacks. So we want to prevent the occurrence of attacks. But as we said, you can only minimize. So that means in the end, we're also going to think about response. So in the event of an attack, we want to be able to respond. And of course, as part of response, you want to be able to detect that an attack has actually happened. Many a time, when attackers attack the system, they'll actually they're actually going to take steps to ensure that they are not discovered, particularly if somebody's, for instance, trying to get information. If you have an eavesdropping attack, then the attacker is actually going to take steps to ensure that they are not discovered on the network. I told you before that the thing that you're actually trying to protect are your network resources, and these resources could be information, so they could be informational. These resources could be data. It could be end user systems. So end user systems like lifts, like actual computers, like so any end user system could be a target for attack. It could be the network itself. For instance, you could have a situation where an attack on availability, and people don't know what they're trying to bring down a service. So usually what they do is attack the network and overload it. Then threats could be of several varieties. Um, Threats could actually also be of several varieties. So you could have what you call accidental threats, which include things like earthquakes, like fires, or simply a user, um, a user accidentally deleting a file. So this actually does happen if the users are not familiar with the system. Then the other thing that you could have is a passive threat. So a passive threat is one that does not actually change the system state. So this could include things like eavesdropping, where the system threat, rather the system state is not changed. Sorry. So here they talk about modification of the system's resources. So if I want to get information, I would probably just be sitting there. If I'm doing a man-in-the-middle attack, for instance, I'm going to be just sitting there on the network and listening. These are also related to active threats in the sense that usually active threats, which are threats which actually are going to modify the systems, the system resources like a malware attack, will initially begin as passive threats, because usually in order to actually attack the system in a destructive way, you have to first of all gather information about the system. So back to accidental attacks, we already spoke about, a user accidentally deleting, a file that would fall into users not having familiarity with the system. Natural disasters, there's a class here of attacks called garbology, where actually people go and study your trash. If you do not dispose of your files properly, if you don't shred them properly, then you could be a victim of garbology. So it's not necessarily accidental. Sometimes this is really intended, as in somebody will have purposely go into your trash of your company to actually go through your to see if there's any information that you could have discarded. Sometimes people even discard hard drives, and these hard drives, people could actually go and and do a deep dive into the hard drive and discover information that they are not supposed to have access to. A good example of this is the Iran Contra affair, which was a big scandal, I think, in the 70s. This is your homework. You can actually go and look it up and see the issues. But this all began with somebody going through the garbage of the I believe the CIA, and discovering files that have been poorly shredded and reconstructing those files and then uncovering a very big scandal. Then of course you can have deliberate or malicious attacks, which probably one of most where you spend most of your money in security. But of course accidental attacks are also a very big issue that you have to look out for. So deliberate attacks include things, like the salami attack. Salami attack is when you create code to siphon off a small amount of every transaction. For instance, you've seen this very commonly with mobile money, where staffers actually decide to take off like 0.1% of a transaction from every transaction. And if you think of the number of transactions that take place during mobile money on the mobile money platform, that actually works out a very big amount of money. Then of course these attacks could also be covert or overt. When the attack is covert, a deliberate effort is made to ensure that the attacker is not discovered. And when the attack is overt, it is the opposite. The attacker actually wants to be. So this is an open attack on the system. For instance, the kind of attacks that Anonymous has been seen to be doing when they come up and they even make a press release and tell you they're going to bring down your systems. So usually this involves some kind of political activism, for instance, cyber terrorism. With a covert attack, typically, for instance, with eavesdropping, if you're doing industrial espionage, and the goal is to obtain information about your competitor. For instance, if Airtel is trying to get information about MTN, it will try as much as possible to make sure that you're not, because the longer you stay on the network, the more information you actually gain. So in general, with security, you have what you call a CIA model, which stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. With confidentiality, you are basically trying to it's the principle that information it's the principle that resources should not become available to people who are not authorized to access those resources. So these resources could be data, it could be connections, and so on and so forth. So these resources should not become available, should not be viewable, should not be disclosed to individuals and agents that are not authorized to view them. Then integrity is about ensuring that the system state is not changed by anybody who is not authorized to do so. We talk about data and information here in the slide, but it actually goes beyond that to even things like connections to the actual systems themselves, because somebody could actually go into your facility and install a device. So that would actually be an attack on integrity, because they managed to get into your organization and install a phantom device. Then availability is about ensuring that resources are available to authorized individuals when they need them, and this will entail two additional sub concepts where you have authentication. In order to provide availability with integrity and confidentiality, you need these additional mechanisms. So the CIA is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but you need these additional mechanisms in order to enforce it. So authentication is about identifying that an agent is who they claim to be. So this agent could be a user. It also could be a software. You can also authenticate software. For instance, if you're trying to install applications on Windows, for instance, it's very common. Sometimes you see a message which is just a minute. Let me address this warning. So sometimes you actually encounter a message telling you that that Windows cannot recognize the certificate from which they cannot recognize the certificate of the publisher. So in that case, the operating system is actually trying to authenticate the software itself. Then secondly, authorization. Authorization is about determining and ensuring that you grant the correct privileges on any to the right user on any given resource. Yeah. So these privileges could be things like such as read, write, execute. So in other words, authorization in short is really about user access control. You have to ensure that you do not grant resources meant for the guest user to the admin user. So then of course you could also have non-automated or direct system penetration. If you have, for instance, if you have very poor physical security, then a hacker does not necessarily have to go ahead and go through all the trouble of hacking. They can simply walk into your organization and take the server with them. So in that case, you do not have, it is direct system penetration. And usually, to obtain this kind of penetration, you'd have to employ something For instance, a hacker could steal your password or something you have. A hacker could steal your access card, or actually hijack an actual user. You've seen this in the movies where they hijack somebody or then cut off his finger or something like that, and then actually use the person to access a restricted system. Then of course you could have this automated or indirect system penetration. Many of these are based on malware, so it's basically malware attack. And the malware attack could take several forms. It could be a worm. Worm is really a self-contained program which is capable of replicating and spreading several machines. An example is the Morris worm in 1988. Then another variation on the worm is a Trojan. So a Trojan is essentially a program that pretends to be doing one thing when it's actually doing another. If you've gone, some of you like to download movies off the internet or anything that should be anything that you may be downloading from these websites that have free versions of things that should be paid for, like software. It is not. Sometimes the software is trojanized. It has been modified to have an additional payload of a Trojan, and that Trojan usually has a trapdoor or a backdoor. So a backdoor is essentially additional logic that is inserted in the program to enable. It is additional logic that is inserted into the program to enable an attacker to access the system by bypassing the normal login procedure. Then another category that you could think of is what you call a logic or time bomb. So a logic or time bomb is basically any malware-based attack in which the malware remains dormant and is activated by some trigger event. If the trigger event is time, then it's referred to as a time bomb. So a logic bomb actually could overlap over viruses and worms and trojans. The other sub flavor of trojans I didn't mention is that remote administrative trojan, or RAT. So a remote administrative trojan is a kind of trojan that will actually be employed to hijack administrative control of a system remotely. So basically this means you can have what you call ransomware. So ransomware is basically built on top of a remote administrative trojan, or a RAT. So ransomware basically is a kind of attack where I take over your system and then I instruct you to deposit money in some account, usually a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency account, before I can give you back control of your system. And this would require, of course, a backdoor or trapdoor. And of course, this would have been would have started as a Trojan attack. So I'm going to stop here for a bit, just to ensure that the presentation doesn't become too long. Then I'm going to continue with a new presentation.